Okay.
Hello, James. Welcome back to the show for possibly the fourth or fifth time. We're not sure, but it's certainly a welcome back.
Well, it's good to be back on. I know I've been on a few times before, but not for a while, so I've missed it.
It's we were joking just before we started. I don't even know how it came about, but I was saying I'm going to do a 3, 2, 1 countdown, and then James sort of went yes, or nervously. Said, and then someone's going to come and just cut your head off, James. But we actually managed to keep it together when I did the 3, 2, 1 countdown.
You did. You did a really good job.
Yeah,
I'm impressed.
I stayed professional for about 2 seconds, and then it all went. But it's really good to have you on, and I'm really glad you've kept your head.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
So we are talking about something that I didn't know using the terms that we're going to be discussing, but certainly when we had a bit of a conversation about this the other day, I was like, oh, this is something that I really dig, and I feel like is a conversation that I think, for both of us personally, we've got a different take on, but I also feel like for change workers, this is going to be a kind of interesting and hopefully very useful conversation, I think, for any kind of change worker to not necessarily adopt wholesale what we're going to talk about here, but really be in that inquiry of let me just check I've got the right terms: dialogically versus diagnostically, working dialogically versus diagnostically, tongue twister, in change work. And I feel as though this is actually, I suspect, one way or another, whether it's conscious or not, a growing inquiry for all of us who are in change work, is my sense. I feel like we're having this conversation and it's kind of beyond you and I. Just setting that as a kind of broader inquiry, I guess, before we get in.
That actually makes sense to me. I think this is something that's very much in the air or in the water. I'd also say, although the kind of focus here is on change work, to me, this is relevant not just to the practitioner, but to anybody that's looking to understand themselves, how they are, and how they change.
Yes. Oh, I love that. That's a kind of secondary inquiry, to a thread to keep going. So before we start, what do you mean by these terms? The diagnostic one, I think, is obvious, but it would be good, actually, I think, in juxtaposition to define both, again, particularly when it applies to change work.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to start with this idea of diagnostic change work. And this is something that's common sense. Okay. And this is why it trips people up, I think. People tend to fall for this as being a valid, workable idea. And you see it all over the place in the world, not just in terms of change work, but in terms of organizational development, people working in organizations. But we human beings, we like to understand things, and we like to think about things sort of mechanically a lot of the time, or at least modern human beings do. So we think everything in terms of machines. We've still got a very much a Newtonian model of the world and of people and this sort of thing. So people often think, well, if we want to solve a problem or change something, we need to, if there's a problem here, we need to diagnose the problem. What's causing the problem? What are the causes? And when we find out what's causing the problem, and we know what we want the functional thing to look like, then we can, from our diagnosis, we can create some kind of intervention or do some tinkering or fix this thing. And then from the outcome is that we've got the result that we want. And it's common sense. It seems really obvious. There's something wrong. We got to diagnose it, come up with a remedy, implement the remedy, and then we get our result. But we human beings we're not machines.
Can I just ask something? Can I just stop you there and question that? I didn't mean that. Can I just take a very slight detour? I'm hoping, which is, I'm sure you're aware of the way of speaking about consciousness kind of like adapts according to the technology at the time. You just referred to it. And it's one, I guess you could say, theory that, at times where we've been working in I don't know, prior to machines, I think even types of machines, ones that are water-based versus electrical. So throughout time, we've had this idea of this is how things work, and then we apply that to how we think the human mind works.
Yeah, yeah,
And of course, now the latest is computers. So we kind of apply that as a metaphor to how the human mind works, which I
right.
don't think is hugely different to thinking of them as machines, but it's subtly different. So I just wanted to bring that in. I think what everything you're saying broadly still applies, in that we think, okay, just like if a computer's not working, we can run diagnostics and figure out what's happening. I
Hmm.
just wondered if there is a slight distinction, I think, between machines in a kind of, like, it feels like there's a kind of almost like a brute force and a much more mechanical
Yeah.
model versus a more computer model. So I just wondered if there's anything you might want to add with that
Well,
worldview.
only that whether you take it on a more kind of old school Newtonian mechanics model or more of a computer model, the idea of diagnosis still applies. Debugging the code. We've got to get into the code, find out what's wrong and what needs fixing in the code. Or even, I mean, a big part of my background is neurolinguistic programming, NLP. And you can hear it right there. Neurolinguistic programming, that
Yeah.
computer metaphor, right?
Works really well.
It's front and center.
Mm.
So there's this kind of idea. I'll share this little piece which I've shared before. I hope not on your podcast though. Many years ago, I was in a band, my first band that I was ever in. We were preparing for a gig. It's our first big gig, and the drummer left about 2 weeks before. So instead of canceling the gig, we bought a drum machine, and we carried on with this drum machine. And now drummers get a lot of flack on the music scene, or they certainly did back in the early 90s. And you'd hear a lot of drummer jokes going around.
My mother used to date a drummer, so I
Right,
know of
right.
it that way.
So you may have heard some of the drummer jokes, but they're always the butt of the joke. The
Mm.
drummer is the butt of the joke. And there was this joke that I used to hear over and over again because we had a drum machine. People would say, "What's the difference between a drummer and a drum machine?" Right? Have you heard this? Have you
No,
heard
no,
this?
I
Right.
haven't.
So what's the difference between a drummer and a drum machine? You only have to punch the information into a drum machine once. Right.
Oh.
This was the harsh joke that people used to sort of share around. Now, here's the thing. I've often said that whoever came up with that joke understood something about human beings that the creators of neurolinguistic programming missed.
Mm.
Right. Or at least I don't think that's fair to say, but certainly when they were naming it neurolinguistic programming, they were buying into a metaphor that overlooked something. There is a fundamental difference between a programmable machine and a human being.
Mm.
Um,
Yes. Oh, I'm glad we took this little detour, aren't you?
yes, yes. I mean, this is the thing, the detours,
And
that's
you
where all
got
the
to
gold lies.
tell your
Yeah.
joke.
I got to tell my joke. Yeah. Probably offend maybe a whole bunch of drummers at the same time, but it's not my joke. I just want to say it's a joke I heard. So, but this is a really important thing. It's like, well, we work fundamentally differently. Learning organisms,
Mm.
self-organizing systems. This is the thing. It's about self-organizing systems. A computer. Now, this is a particularly interesting thing as well. This point you make about our consciousness being shaped by the sort of technological metaphors of the age. The funny thing is, in the world of self-development, the sort of mind, psyche, consciousness change, it's still quite dominated by this sort of programming metaphor in some ways or another, whether it's explicit or implicit. But if you actually look at the world of computing, the cutting edge stuff is trying to look the other way.
Yes, so true.
So you've got these two things. You've got this human world looking towards the machine world and the machine world looking towards the human world.
Oh, wow. Love that. Yes. Yeah. The much more emergent kind of like verging on consciousness of AI, which, as you say, is trying to mimic the much more complex organism of the human.
Yeah, right. So I mean, the cutting edge stuff in AI is building learning learning intelligences,
Yes.
ones that are able to self-organize, to self-direct their own evolution of understanding and this kind of thing. And it doesn't happen. So these machines, they're not programmed in the same way. I mean, at a higher level, they are programmed, but they're programmed to be self-organizing. They're programmed to be much more organic in how they approach putting together their expertise sets or their understanding sets. They can do it fast because they can do a lot of iterations very quickly, unlike we human beings are a little bit more slowed down. So I'm just thinking about ChatGPT, which is all the rage at the moment. I've been interacting a lot with this. It's very interesting interacting with that, because if you ask it a question, and it will answer or give you something good, but then you can ask it like all sorts of weird curveball questions, right? If you didn't get the answer you wanted, you don't have to reprogram the thing. You just invite it to inquire, to look differently or connect up ideas differently, which you can do with ChatGPT. You can get it to compare and contrast all sorts of disparate stuff, or make connections, or even give you its own opinion about connections between disparate things. And all of this is coming from modeling how neural networks work, or how life works, or how the kind of complex systems we see in nature work. And this is the important thing to realize is, for changework practitioners, we're not sitting there dealing with a computer or a drum machine or something that's got a bug in its code that we need to sit there and rewrite the code. Now, as I say, I come from an NLP background and a hypnosis background. A lot of classical hypnotists have got this idea, all we need to do is put the right suggestion into the person's mind and off it goes, and we get that specific outcome. Now, I've been doing change work since 2006, and I know full well that I don't control anything in a change work session, right? I know full well the real moments of change and transformation are not the ones I get to pick ahead of time.
Oh, yes.
And I also know that the outcome that the client gets may or may not be closer to or further from what they might have thought it would be ahead of time. So there's that old Steve Jobs saying, you cannot connect the dots looking forward, only looking back. And this is the dialogic approach, because if you look at, so we've looked at diagnostic. Diagnostic says, here's a machine that works in a particular way, and whether it's a mechanical machine or a set of programming, a bunch of programs, and we need to look at what's wrong, debug the code, or put the new lines of code in, and now everything's going to work. That's one view. Or you recognize the complex adaptive nature of this incredible system that you're working with. And by system, you could say, well, that's the client, but really it's the client in their life. And as soon as you sat with them, you change the dynamics of the system anyway by sitting with them. So instead of looking at that, it's now working with how is it that the different elements that comprise the system are interacting, influencing each other, And so for me, dialogic change work is about looking at the relationships between the disparate aspects of the system. And it's recognizing, what's now dialogic is a metaphor. It's a metaphor of talk, of communication. So you could say, well, this aspect of the client is in communication with that aspect, or not in communication with that aspect. It doesn't necessarily mean talk. It means communication. So it's looking at, where is communication taking place? What are the ideas that are being communicated? What are the implications of that communication? So when we change the connections or whatever, what happens as a result? Now, the important thing to recognize here as well is people are self-organizing systems. They have an emergent adaptive intelligence, right? Now, people are adapted to the lives they've got, but that adaptedness comes from an adaptiveness.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Now, what often happens is people adapt, and then their adaptiveness switches off. Job done. This is what's, so everything becomes fixed in a certain way, or a certain set of patterns perpetuating. Now, that doesn't mean their adaptive capacity, their adaptive intelligence isn't there. It just means it kind of tends to go offline when people think my job of putting life together is done. You know, I know
Which
what's what now.
yeah, so if we can pause here for a moment, because
Yeah, interrupt me as much as you like, Leanne, because you're interrupting.
right.
No, this is the point of dialogic.
Mm.
If I just talk, that's not a dialogue. You see what I mean? But we will create more through a dialogue. We will create connections that we wouldn't pick ahead of time independently. So
Very
I'm
meta,
very happy
yes.
for you to interrupt as much as you wish.
Wonderful, thank you. So it felt like a timely point to do it, partly just because I think there's just a wealth of things that kind of can come, like all sorts of tangents and offshoots from that, what you've just outlined. And a couple of points that felt like interesting ones to start off to like threads for us to pull on and see where they lead. Firstly, just picking up what you were just saying in terms of that point where it's almost like I've done adapting, you know, like this is my life, I've done adapting to it. And I was just looking at it from a point of view of and we may have touched on this actually in the episode I did on your show, where we eventually spoke a little bit about shadow work.
Yeah.
After about an hour speaking about everything else.
Yeah.
And I can't even remember if we did get into this or not, what I'm about to say, but how this is like I'm really generically speaking. We can either arrange our lives so that we're not being triggered very often. So life isn't kind of feeling too full of hooks that hook us.
Yeah.
Or we can kind of allow ourselves to like be in a bigger life that is going to provide lots of kind of new experiences and be full of unknowns, therefore probably full of things that are going to trigger us, and then be in that work of looking at what's going on internally that's being triggered. And that just came to mind when you were talking about this, like I think, and that's very binary and generic what I've just said clearly, but it just popped into my mind as you said that, where I think if we, depending on our worldview, if we think success is getting to that place where it's like, okay, I'm not, you know, if life feels safe, I feel okay, like life isn't feeling too scary, i.e. I'm, you know, shadows not being triggered too much, it could look like, okay, it's great, I've done adapting. Versus if our worldview is one where it is a constantly, you know, generative emerging experience, then we may not use this language, but we're kind of recognizing like that is going to require continual adaptation.
Right. You know, that's really interesting that you should say that. I'm going to say some things now which are really maybe going off on a tangent, but they're totally resonant with what you're saying.
I've still got another tangent we need to go on, by the way, but I'll remember that.
Okay. So I love adaptiveness as a concept, right? For me, it's a high ideal, and it was an unconscious high ideal for a long time before I brought it into consciousness to know that that was a major why for me, is developing my adaptiveness. Okay, my adaptedness and adaptiveness. I'm not talking about changework here. I'm talking about, you know, my own
personally, yes,
personal stuff in life. Although I do bring these lenses to the work that I do. And, you know, so I'm interested in being adapted for this life, for this world. Obviously, I want to be the best me that I can be to create with the life that I find myself in and the circumstances I find myself in. However, those circumstances can change, you know, and these days in this modern crazy world, these circumstances seem to change a lot and seem to change fast. So the other side of it is adaptiveness, right? So those people who are trying to get finished, oh, I've done it, I've done my work, I'm here. And then whoop, the conditions of the game suddenly change. And it's, oh my goodness me, this is a terrible thing. Now, I see a lot in the world right now. I see a lot of people panicking about stuff, right? And I see them looking at things going, that's a terrible thing that's happening. That's a terrible thing. Even we were talking about ChatGPT. you know, that's going to be a huge disruptor, a huge game changer for a lot of people. I was telling my mom about this, and she's like, "This is horrible." And she said, I'm just thankful I'm old and I won't be around to see what it, you know, and all of this kind of thing." And I'm like, yeah, I'd have no idea where this is going to lead, but the world is getting turned on its head all the time. And some people highlight the downsides of that, right?
Just as an aside, my mind was going haywire then, because I mentioned my mum dating a drummer, and then you mentioned your mum. My mind went this like really weird thing, like my mum dated a drummer, and then drum machine, and then James's mum dated ChatGPT. My mind was just like,
No,
she's
not dated it yet. Quite the opposite. It has failed to seduce her. But my only point here is, like, you know, and forgive me if this is too far outside of scope, okay? I think the world is really changing.
Is there such a thing? Is there such a thing on this show? I don't know.
I don't know, but I think that in a sense we may have passed a period of peak comfort and stability in global society, right?
Oh.
Right. I think there's a chance that's the case. Now, a lot of people think that as well. They wouldn't put it in those terms.
And there is something quite spicy about the terms you've just used for some reason. I don't know why.
Well, I don't know. I think it's because people assume that these good years that we've had, where there's been an abundance of cheap goods and food's been relatively cheap, and you know, if life were to get more, it's a very rare period of human history. Certainly, and I don't want to project this to everybody in the world, but certainly for us in the UK, people in the West, there's been an extended period of comfort, prosperity, this kind of thing. And I think that is changing, and it's freaking a lot of people out, right? But to me, it doesn't freak me out, because the question is this: are we most alive when we're most comfortable? You know, are we most alive when things are just easy and the seas are calm and the sun's shining? Is that really when we're most alive? Or are we most alive when there is at least some kind of challenge to stimulate us, that we are able to adapt to, you know, that we're there, a challenge to meet something? Now, I know some people don't enjoy that, but partly that's their own thinking. I mean, you and I both have plenty of experiences with the kind of 3 principles model and this kind of thing. And I think that we can be highly adaptive without having to be anxiously be meeting everything and going, oh God, you know, so we actually can be grounded still in the middle of a storm, so to speak. And I suspect that we're more alive when we're sort of connected to stuff that's making us move, that's making us respond, that's putting us in a position where we have to think differently and face new challenges, you know.
Yes,
so
I love that. It's kind of like to be truly fully human is to be adaptive.
Yeah, and I think it is. That is the nature of life. Even, you know, you could look at it.
Change.
Yes, life is change. You could look at it on an individual level, or you could look at it on the you know, across the grand scheme of everything, across the whole arc of evolution. What's evolution about? It's about adaptation. It's about adaptively meeting new challenges. So I love the idea of adaptiveness on a personal level. It's a high value for me, but it actually also creates a lot of what Nassim Nicholas Taleb would call anti-fragility. So it's not resilience, but it's the ability to change and grow as a result of perhaps, you know, what might seem initially to be noxious stimulants, or things that you might prefer on some superficial level were not, you know, were not challenges. And this is a really important thing for change work as well, because the truth of the matter is, people only really change when there's some major disruption either in their lives or in their belief systems.
I'm going to bring in the other tangent.
Yeah,
I feel like this is quite timely. So with the that hypothesis that you've just raised, people only change when, you know, something almost like comes in as a prompt for them to change, orient differently around. And so, as you say, that can be an external change, or you could say, you said like in their belief system. So the other tangent I was pondering as you were talking about these kind of this self-organizing system as a human,
Mm,
and how kind of recognizing there's all these different things that are going to be in conversation. And the challenge, and I know you know this, just to be clear, this is not me lecturing you, you know this as well as I do. The challenge is so much of that is unseen. But it's
yeah.
unseen to, if we're talking about change work, it's unseen to the client, and it's unseen to the change worker.
Mm,
And as far as I know, that will always be the case. We're going to be one way or another being able to see more, but there's infinite stuff behind the hood, we could
yeah.
say, in the unconscious.
Yeah.
And hence it kind of is a bit kind of, you know, that those games where you sort of, I don't know, put your hands in a box and you're feeling around. It's
Yeah.
like the box is bloody infinite, and it's like no matter how many things you feel, there's another thing to feel.
Yeah.
And so as you were saying that about the change can come from a kind of shift in their internal beliefs, certainly just talking personally, so much of change that I've experienced personally hasn't it's come like seemingly completely out of the blue from a part of me maybe I could call soul, where it's like been this kind of like, now this is the thing to do, this is the
Mm,
thing to orientate around, which then requires a whole bunch of adapting to in
mm,
order to even be able to choose that or be in relationship to it. And so there's
mm.
two parts to this. One, that came to mind, but also just this exploring the fact there's like known parts of the system, and there's also unknown parts of the system, and
Right.
both
Right.
are going to be in conversation and potentially going to the young quotes, probably the most quoted of all quotes, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our life and we'll call it fate. Potentially the unconscious is having even more of an impact than the conscious.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing I'll say here about diagnostic versus dialogic again, because this relates to what you're saying. The point about the diagnostic approach is it assumes that there are no unknown interdependencies,
Oh yes,
right?
yes. Hmm.
And that's
Yes,
where it
by its
falls apart
nature.
immediately, right? Because we have to
Mm.
know. My father was an engineer, so he has a good piece of engineering advice, which is if you're about to fix a problem or something, you look to see what's there. Now, that's great if all that is there is seeable and is knowable.
Mm.
If it isn't, you cannot use a diagnostic approach.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, this is true. Now, in human beings, you could look at human beings as networks, complex networks, in a variety of different ways. You could look at them as a network of belief systems, right? Or a network of beliefs, a network of ideas, a network of concepts, right? Or you could look at them as neural networks. You could look at them as psychosocial networks extending out. There's a lot of levels you could do a network analysis at. Inside of those, you can't see more than the surface. So you've got not only unknown interdependencies within that network, I would suspect you've got unknowable interdependencies,
Mm.
right? So I think like Jung's approach of making the unconscious conscious, to me, that's a huge part of what I do. I'm a big fan of what I call the spotlight of consciousness and shining that into what hasn't been witnessed, what hasn't been seen. But I also recognize that there are certain interdependencies that will forever be unknown, and they are
Yes. Mm.
unknowable. And we
Mhm.
still are charged with dancing and creating with them, even though we cannot know them apart from perhaps by their effects or by,
Mm.
by peripheral means.
And when you say unknowable, do you mean, and maybe it's both, are they unknowable because of something like inherent in their nature that makes them unknowable? Or are they unknowable just because there's infinite things and therefore we can never know them all?
I think both and more. So I think they're unknowable.
We can't even know everything we don't
Yeah.
than there is to not know about the unknowable things.
Well, there's a line I love from Heisenberg. I think it was from Werner Heisenberg or something like this, but who knows? You know, people say these quotes from so and
Yeah,
so.
it was either Einstein, Jung, or
I think this was Heisenberg who said something like, and I'll be paraphrasing, the universe is not only more complex than you think, it's more complex than you can think.
Yes, I think
Right.
you quoted that last time, and I think you attributed it to Heisenberg last time. So at least
I
there's
would
consistency.
I would definitely be consistent in attributing it to Heisenberg until I find out otherwise. But you know, the idea being is that our systems of representation are, as Alfred Korzybski said, the map is not the territory, and the territory is always more complex than the map. And
I didn't even know there was someone to attribute that to. That's interesting.
yeah, it's from Alfred Korzybski, of the originator of this system known as general semantics, which was a big influence on NLP. That's a whole other conversation. I'm a big fan of Korzybski's work.
Yeah, I just thought it was one of those, like, not parables, but you know, just one of those things that everyone says, but there isn't a place to that anyone knows it comes from.
Yeah,
anyway, I found that out. You found out about Micronesia today.
that's right. Korzybski, though, I mean, he definitely was the originator of that quote. So that one's not in the realms of speculation. So you've got this kind of thing going on. Now, by the way, when you say the unconscious versus the conscious, I'm just going to highlight that again is a map. It's a psychological lens. It's a way of looking at things. I tend not to work with that when I'm doing change work. I tend to work with consciousness and the system, which most of everything is outside of consciousness, but there's a lot of value in being able to direct the attention of consciousness. And I think consciousness itself, if we take it as in human consciousness, our everyday experience of awareness of something and awareness that we are aware, I think that has a particular function within us and within our adaptive system. So I think consciousness, as we would use it in an everyday sense, is actually not a doing faculty of mind. It is a learning faculty of mind. So it is about seeing things in order to make new connections. It is also, in a sense, a facilitator of the internal dialogic when you shine that spotlight of consciousness in.
Yeah, so you're using consciousness, I guess a rough synonym could be focus, or
in a sense, I mean, because you could use consciousness in a general sense and look at the phenomenon of, as we experience it, or you could say, well, this consciousness is like some kind of extra extension of the universe or something, or maybe the foundational matter of the universe. But when I'm talking about consciousness, I'm just talking about awareness, but awareness that you are, see, I can't use it without referring to self-conscious of.
Should we say focused awareness?
Yes, I guess so. Although sometimes consciousness isn't that focused. It can be quite diffuse.
Yes, this is true.
So I'm not even sure about like the focus bit, but what I'm talking about is when right now I'm looking at my therapy putty for squeezing, and I'm looking at it, and I know I'm seeing it right now. Right, I know I'm seeing it. If somebody threw it at my head when I wasn't anticipating that,
if you still had a head,
if I still had a head, yeah, or they threw it at my torso,
you wouldn't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't know, but I might have reacted to it already before I was conscious of it. So I would still be aware of it, but I'd have been aware outside of consciousness, and then I go, "What was that?" Oh, you know. So there's some different levels, but when I'm doing change work with people, consciousness is really important, but not consciousness as in I must consciously try and do something differently. It's not about that consciousness that sometimes people think, well, I'm going to now, wrench the thing consciously into a different shape. But that consciousness, bringing our consciousness into our system, creates the opportunity for a new dialogic process to occur. Even attending to something in consciousness that we haven't looked before will create a new internal communication loop that will be generative. Right?
Yeah. Are you familiar with Daniel Ingram and his work?
Only because when you say Daniel Ingram, I have a memory of your voice saying Daniel Ingram before.
Oh,
but
that's
but
funny.
yeah, but it might be imagined. So please do fill me in. Give me the top line.
So he's actually quite hard to sum up, but he is an incredible man who is kind of like has this depth of experience and understanding in kind of like more what you could say like spiritual terms, but also magical. So he embodies both to like an incredible degree. I'm not doing him justice even in that. And I interviewed him on Tuesday, and he has his definition of magic is something like consciousness plus intent. And that just popped into my mind in that what you're just saying, it's like when those things and then something meets, something changes by its very nature. It's like all the time something's changing. Which is the case anyway, but I think particularly when there's intent, like, you know, that's part of the basis for alchemy in a way. It's like then that sort of change is on steroids.
Right.
Total mix of metaphors there.
Yeah. That's all good. I mean, that really resonates for me. Like one of the most basic, one of the simplest models I have for doing change work is actually borrowed from Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert's stuff when they were doing LSD trials back in the 60s and looking at facilitating change, transformation with that. And they had this idea of set and setting. Now, I'm not claiming, I'm not claiming I understand this. I'm not a scholar of anything. I'm a practitioner. So I caution people from taking what I say at face value. But this is what I got from this idea of set and setting, whether it's what they intended or not. Is the two most important things are the context in which you're going to do the work, the setting, and the set, which is the mindset, the intention, right? Here's what we're looking to do. We want to have a center to the work that we're doing. It doesn't, I do not believe it is useful to have an overly rigid goal unless it is accepted that that overly rigid goal is a part of a bigger conversation and not the, you know, the chosen criteria by which we measure success of the session. Right.
I'm really glad we've taken. Sorry, did you have more to say there?
No, I'm happy to go in any direction we want because this is a co-creation. And...
no, I just thought I'd literally interrupted you. Were you about to finish the sentence?
No, go ahead.
Or paragraph. Oh, by the way, this is my equivalent of your therapy party.
Oh, right.
It's a thing of beauty, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a thing of beauty. It is.
I really love the way we've just kind of like weaved towards the set and setting, and then this kind of work with psychedelics, which of course has an ancient history in terms of, you know, most cultures in the world have some form of working with trance, whether that be plant medicines or some other, you know, drumming or whatever. And although they were using these particular terms, set and setting, again, this is ancient wisdom. You know, any shaman worth their salt, if they were creating a ceremony, would naturally have that within that set, that set and setting would be taken care of within the ceremony. And likewise, going back to what you were just saying, there wouldn't be this fixed outcome. You know, say, for example, it was, you know, a shaman and a client. In just the way you're saying, there wouldn't be this fixed intent. There would be an absolute, very conscious understanding that it's in the hands of spirit.
Yeah. And I think that really makes sense because my view is when I'm doing change work with somebody, the outcome is not in my hands and it's not in the hands of the client i.e. their conscious representation of themselves,
Mm.
it is in the hands of something greater, something emergent, an emergent intelligence that goes beyond either of us individually or both of us together or both of us in our environments. Now, you could call it spirit, right? Just as easily. Now, I actually have here's a perspective, and I want to offer this as a perspective and not claim it as a truth, okay? Because I don't want to be reductionist about things like spirit, but this is going to sound like a reductionist metaphor, possibly so. So I just want to put
We'll
that
forgive
caveat
you.
in.
You got a lot of leeway here, James.
Okay. So let's just take it as read right from the beginning that Heisenberg is right. The universe is not any more complex than we think. It's more complex than we can think. Let's also look at the idea of self-organization, that it's not just us that's self-organizing, it's nature, it's everything that's self-organizing. So we could see everything, nature, everything self-organizing is being possessed of an adaptive intelligence. Now, again, let's go back to the map. It's not the territory. We human beings are charged with being a part of and working with this complexity, being of it and being within it and all of this, right? Now, as we do that, one way of experiencing that and making sense of that, to me, is spirit. If you go back and you look at animistic traditions, you could look at that as being a way of making sense, making a human kind of sense of something incredibly rich that's beyond our understanding. But we know that it's about relationships. We know that fundamentally. We know it's about qualities and relationships and interactions and all of this. And this is what's inherent within an animistic worldview that gets lost within a monotheistic worldview, which is all top-down command and control. You know, the animistic worldview sees everything as being a kind of collection of relationships and different elements with different qualities, and that there's a harmony that needs to be worked with and respected and appreciated and nurtured. So it's a very, very different approach from the top-down command and control that you get with monotheism. Now, I think this isn't just like people look at it and go, oh, it's just different myths, it's just different religions, it's just different spiritual beliefs. No, it's people looking for ways to work with reality at its deepest levels and in most functional ways. I think the top-down command and control approach has given something to the world, but I think it's now getting to the point where it's reached the edges of its immediate utility and is now causing more problems in a lot of places than we might like. So attempts to control things tend to go badly as systems get more and more complex, right? So like this is, I think there's a lot to this. And I think, again, if we respect this and we go, okay, so we're working with a system, we're working with an intelligence here, none of us get to choose. The client doesn't say, this is what I want. If they're acting according to a diagnostic paradigm, that will work against them because they will be trying to control something uncontrollable. Instead of dancing with creative energies or working with the generative intelligence or whatever it might be, they're trying to control the uncontrollable. Good luck. It's not going to work.
You're not going to understand why it doesn't work.
Yeah, and if it does work, because sometimes it apparently does, if it does work, it works for reasons that you didn't see. It works for reasons that are different from the ones you think.
So I love the way that you've this conversation is kind of, I mean, I love how we've started and where we've ended up is just fabulous. We're almost out of time, but what a place to, what a cliffhanger to end it on. What you're talking there about an animist worldview, and it occurs to me that let's put aside whether it's true or not for the moment. I really love what you were just saying, or what I was hearing what you're saying. It's like, from that worldview, it's it's kind of it's so useful because it helps us work with these things in a way that appears to be more similar to how things actually are, as far as we can understand. Like, it allows for that complexity, it allows for that understanding of relationships between things. It just naturally brings that, whether or not that's like, whether or not it literally is as per the animist view, what it does bring us is this much more honoring of the complexity. And weirdly, I think maybe perhaps because of the way round I've come into that worldview, that hadn't actually occurred to me as clearly as that. So because of my, I guess, shamanic path, at some point or other, I just sort of realized I'd kind of like adopted, or that worldview had just kind of like entered into my system as, okay, that now, like, it just increasingly makes sense. And so it's because I was already in that worldview, I've not actually seen how useful it is until I've just like, it's just like, of course, all that comes with that, I'm now used to. That's just like the water I swim in. And I hadn't actually realized like how actually useful it is until you just said there's something really, and it's like, at the moment, you could say that animist worldview potentially is a metaphor. And maybe we can only ever get to a metaphor when it's something so complex, but there's something so beautiful in what that offers.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, a big influence on me that's always been there, sits in the background, is Taoism. And one theory I heard of Taoism is ancient, and it actually goes back to this sort of what some people refer to as proto-shamanism. And I don't know if this is true or not, but there's one theory that as human beings, the ancestors of us that left Africa, however many hundreds of thousands of years ago or whatever, they brought with them this sort of proto-shamanism, an animistic, systemic view of life. And that actually Taoism is part of the, you know, it's still, it comes from that. It's very ancient. It comes from that, and it's taken a different form. I think one of the interesting things about those sorts of paradigms versus more reductionist scientific sort of paradigms is they are fundamentally pragmatic in their nature. They're not just finding out about how the world works for the sake of curiosity or whatever. They're about building a relationship with life, or building good, useful, functional, beautiful, enriching relationships with life. So they're coming from a different place. And I think that's why there's a lot of value in them. Now, the modern scientific mind can go, well, that's clearly not true. That's bunk. That's hogwash. You know, where's the evidence for that, and all of that kind of thing. But I think that's somewhat missing the point. It's not really what it's about. You know, it's about how it serves us, how it enriches us.
Yes. Oh, that's. It's just brought something to mind. Actually, I'll name it how my teacher talks about it, which is, I think our modern view of spirituality is very much a kind of around like this sort of like personal enlightenment, you know, and almost for its own sake. And the way he named the difference with shamanism is it's inherently pragmatic. It isn't about enlightenment. It's like literally for the survival of the community. It is spirituality, but it's not mysticism. It's not like for the exploration of consciousness and, you know, self-enlightenment. It is purely about how can this work better? How can I resolve these issues that my community have? It's like inherently spirituality for pragmatic reasons.
Right. And about our relationships with others, with ourselves, with the world around us.
I mean, it's all relationship ultimately. Yes.
Yeah.
And, it's, to an extent you could say, well, we've survived that long because for the vast majority of human history, that was the worldview
Mm,
and the way that we kind of structured our communities that allowed us to survive. This is
yeah.
how we evolved. And so, um, yeah, it feels as though this is totally not where I was expecting our conversation to, I'm going to say, end in quote marks. And it feels like it's going back to your definition of dialogic. It's kind of the conversation ultimately is happening between us and everyone way after this episode finishes. But this feels like a really expansive place that we've arrived.
Yeah, yeah. I think it is. I think it's an important. Have you ever read Jeremy Lent's book, The Patterning Instinct?
No, don't think I have.
It's a very, very interesting book. I keep meaning to go back over it at some point, but there's 1,000 books I want to go back over. But he talks very much about how it's a book about the history of ideas and how it's led to how it's driven history in a particular way and how it's created the current state of affairs on the planet. And his belief is that there is a new resurgence of more systemic relationship-based models of the world coming out of complexity science and this kind of thing. And that basically what complexity science is showing us is pretty much the same kind of stuff as proto-shamanism, as Taoism, as these sorts of things. So we're kind of coming full circle and people are going, oh, and one of the things that he sort of points out is a lot of the detour is started with Plato. So,
really?
yeah, that Plato, instead of seeing us as a part of the world and, there's a lot of respect for the body and yes, spirit's there, but spirit is in everything. It's not a separate from in some different realm up above. And, so therefore the job of, once you get the Platonic ideas coming in, the job of spirituality is to somehow transcend the body and connect with the spirit that is elsewhere and up above, instead of recognizing that spirit is in everything and in the world, and we are in the world. And the world is very, very important under the animistic traditions or under Taoism. It's everything is important. But under the Platonic traditions, that's not so important. The real stuff is something else, whether that's spirit that is up in heaven, the kingdom of heaven being up there, the Platonic ideals that are separate from physical reality. The whole message of Plato's cave is really life as you know it isn't real life. It's like, well, hang on a second. So if the message is life as we know it isn't real life, we can start to perhaps become more casual towards that stuff and not have the reverence that perhaps somebody coming from an animistic background would have for their environment, for the relationships, for these sorts of things. So from Plato onwards, spirituality becomes a much more individualistic approach and much more about getting away from everyday life to some other place. Instead of being about finding our way into life in a more rich, full way.
I had no idea that detour happened with Plato. It's really interesting. The other thing I've really taken from this conversation is, bizarrely, despite having a real deep love for Taoism and for shamanism, for some strange reason, there was kind of fairly disconnected in, like, I often kind of like look through the worldview of both of them, but just hadn't actually seen how, it's just like, as you're talking, I'm like, of course, the 10,000 things. And the one thing, like, of course they are, at root, really the one thing, ironically. That's just fascinating. So thank you. I've learned that also in today's conversation.
And I'm not sure how far we actually got to defining that kind of dialogic versus, but it really does relate because the animism, it's about the animism is a dialogic. It's about all the relationships between things. It's about complex systems. It's about complexity and relationships and working with that, working with the unknown and creating with it. For me, change work is the same. So, the more I can get clients to shift to that place of wonder and possibility and being willing to create with the unknown, and being willing to be surprised and these sorts of things, where they start getting big, powerful shifts. But the more people are rigidly holding on to here's the problem, and it is the way I see it, and here's the solution, and it needs to be this way, and how can we control it from this to this? The more they're in that place, I mean, people can, metaphorically speaking, barely breathe in that place, let alone really grow and flourish and explore and be curious and make new connections and all of these sorts of things, which ultimately is where change comes from.
I love that so much. Potentially ending with this little story, but it may well take us in another direction. But my intention is to bring it to a close soon.
Yeah.
What you're just saying there about that kind of fixation, like the problem is the problem, and it's all about fixing the problem. An experience came to mind of, I think maybe last year. I was in a sweat lodge, and just strange things kept happening. Things kept going wrong, in quote marks. You know, the rocks that were being brought in kept breaking. There were just various things, and like I think someone nearly got burned. And I remember Jez, my teacher, was making us aware, as again through this animist worldview or shamanic worldview, that the spirit of the trickster was present, and you know, bringing in all of this kind of chaos and things not going to plan. And it was so interesting how, I mean, none of that makes sense in a modern worldview anyway, but just to go on this idea of like, therefore there is a problem that needs to be fixed. It was so interesting witnessing the way he was actually like in dialogue with the trickster, making offerings to the trickster, welcoming, like, the trickster's here. It's an energy that's present now. We're not going to just be able to kind of deny it, get rid of it. It's about being in relationship with the trickster.
Yeah. And I think that's such a strong point. Like, if you look at, when I say change work, the kind of change work that I've traditionally done is people coming in. I mean, I used to be a hypnotherapist, and I was working with military veterans. It's people who are going, this is the problem, this is what needs to change. And initially, they're not open to dialogues with anything, right? And let's say you've got somebody saying, well, I'm on this diet, but I keep binge eating on donuts. The last thing they want to do, or at least it never even occurs to them, is to enter into a dialogue with the aspects of self that are doing the donuts. They want to be antagonistic with that. They're like, it's a problem, it needs exorcising or something like this, you know. But it's that ability to have a conversation. I just say this, my friend Ramsey Dukes, Lionel Snell, he has a book, and some people will be shocked by this. It depends on if they're coming from a strict Judeo-Christian worldview. He has a book called The Little Book of Demons, right? Where he's saying, like, and it's a sort of magical, metaphorical book. And he's saying, basically, look, if you start treating problematic aspects of your life, whether they're within yourself and your psyche or in the world around you or whatever, if you treat them as demons, right? And then you look at the old metaphors of demons, you know, doing a deal with the demon. Well, it's kind of useful, because once it's a demon, you can do a deal with a demon. You can negotiate with a demon. You can, you know, maybe there's some kind of, you can enter into a relationship with it in a way that you cannot otherwise. You know, and I had a situation like this with a very, very good friend of mine, where they'd sent me I thought they'd sent me a marketing email, right, about a personal thing. I thought they'd offloaded like a very personal message onto their personal assistant, who'd mistaken it for a marketing thing. And anyway, it was like, and I just made a comment about this, going, hey, look, we're friends, you know. And then this person took it the wrong way, and then it kind of blew up a little bit by email, and they got really paranoid that I was really annoyed with them, and I wasn't. And it was all, and it got really stuck until I decided to go, hey, a demon's messing with me and my good friend. Like, to play this frame, right? It's not about him and it's not about me, it's about the demon. Now, immediately, just that change in organization of reality dissolved the whole problem, just disappeared.
I love that.
You know, and some, now I'm not claiming it's really a demon. I'm just saying that once you start to And something that Lionel said, Lionel Schnell, aka Ramsey Jukes, is that even if you look at this in a more scientific way, and you see once we start anthropomorphizing things, it switches on whole parts of our brain that would otherwise be offline. We are relational creatures. You know,
Yes.
so at the very least, even if we go, oh, none of that stuff's true, at the very least, we go, well, we're starting to bring on board capacities that we have, intelligences that we have within us that are not interested in things, but they're not interested in inanimate things. They're interested in living things. They're interested in psychological things.
I
right?
love this so much. Yes.
Right. So there's a
Yeah.
power to doing this. This is why whether or not, you know, in some forms of change work, people will work with a wounded inner child. Whether there really is, isn't important. The point is that you're now able to have a dialogue, right? A real deep, creative, generative dialogue. And from that, difference emerges. It always does.
Yes. You have walked us beautifully. We've danced so fabulously to a place we can end the show.
Yeah,
I thought we were going to be here for days, James, which
yeah.
would have been all well and good, but I need to go pick my children up in a moment. But
Yes,
this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. I could definitely have carried this on for much, much longer. And I was right when I said we are likely going to go on for longer than planned.
Yep.
We often do.
I think we've done quite well. Well.
Yes.
It's a good pausing point.
Definitely. And I think we are due to come back and do some kind of, maybe not a part 2, but a continuation of a conversation. I think we're planning anyway. So we'll be back again soon and see how this weaves in. For the moment, if listeners have, and I'm sure they will have done, like the sound of the kinds of things that you're talking about, the ways that you work, where can they find out more about you and all the wonderful things you do?
Just go to jamestripp.co.uk. In the not too distant, that will be .com, but at the moment it's still .co.uk, and that's like a hub site, so that will go out to my YouTube channel or my podcast or my book or whatever people are interested in.
Amazing. That was so straightforward after a really complicated conversation.
Yeah, I've only just simplified this. I used to have my YouTube channel over here and that over there, and it's just like boom. I decided I'd go for like a hub site.
I was a bit taken aback. And also I can really recommend going to .com. We've finally, after we have had 2 .cos, we're finally a .com, and I can recommend it, James. It will change your life.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it. I had to pay good money for the .com.
It'll be so worth it. Well, thank you so much. An absolute pleasure as always. And we'll be back again soon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me on.